Millionaire sees pregnant teacher surrounded by fierce dogs. Comment below telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story and I want to get to know you better. So please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The smell of burnt weeds and dry dust filled the air that Tuesday afternoon as I drove down a forgotten dirt road on the outskirts of an abandoned industrial district. Old factories with blown-out windows, graffiti-covered walls, and weeds growing through the cracks of the dead asphalt. It was a shortcut I rarely took, but that day, the city traffic forced me to take a left toward this pocket of silence that seemed forgotten by progress. And it was right there, in that vacuum between what the city used to be and what it never became, that I saw it. In the middle of an open lot, surrounded by rusted chain-link fences and rubble, a pregnant woman was backed into the wall of a collapsed warehouse. Around her, 4 large dogs growled in a circle, their hackles raised, their snouts low. The woman, wearing a backpack and a yellow public school teacher's cardigan, had her arms extended to protect her belly. Her lips moved silently. Either she was praying or she was whispering the name of someone who wasn't there. I slowed down. I looked, and I kept driving. I went almost 1,000 feet before slamming on the brakes in the middle of the road. My conscience kicked in before the brakes even finished screeching. I sat there for 10 whole seconds, hands on the wheel, engine running, the rearview mirror reflecting the distant lot. Then I threw it in reverse. By the time I pulled into the lot, honking and yelling to scare the animals away, the dogs backed off. I got out of the car and stepped between her and the animals, with the posture of someone who neither explains himself nor asks for permission. A few seconds, a few gestures. Functional silence. The woman, a public middle school teacher from the rough side of town, 7 months pregnant and possessing eyes that observed everything with unnerving focus, didn't thank me right away. She studied me. She memorized my license plate. She noticed the small scar on my left hand, the way I purposefully avoided looking at her baby bump with curiosity, and the fact that, when offering her a ride, I opened the back door, not the front, as if I knew she needed space, not company. I dropped her off at the school where she worked. We didn't exchange numbers. I went back to my routine, running a mid-sized logistics company with surgical detachment, living in an apartment way too big for one person in a quiet Midwestern town that still breathed the slow pace of people who have nothing to prove to anyone. But the butterfly effect had already been triggered. 3 days later, I discreetly asked my assistant Arthur to pull up some records on the lot where I had found the woman. The reason was pragmatic. I had considered buying that property years ago, but backed out. Yet when Arthur returned with the report and the owner's name, I recognized Richard immediately. We had crossed paths at a corporate boardroom table 6 years prior, back when I was still part of the world I now pretended to ignore. The world of elites who cut deals in air-conditioned rooms with anonymous consciences. I had walked away from that world after the abrupt passing of my father, who died without asking for forgiveness, but left behind a letter I never showed anyone. A letter that basically confessed that our entire family fortune had been built on the suffering of people who never had a name or a voice. I inherited the company, but I abandoned the lifestyle. I sold the mansion. I fired the private security. I paid off the moral debts I found along the way. I lived simply for a man of my means, carrying the guilt of an entire generation on my shoulders without ever talking about it. When I saw Richard's name on the report, I sat in silence for a long time. Then I called Arthur and asked him to find the teacher's address. During the second week, I drove to the school where she worked. I didn't go inside. I stayed in my car for 20 minutes, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing there. When she walked out and saw me, she didn't look surprised. She just walked up to my window, adjusting the backpack on her shoulder, and said she knew who sent the dogs and that I knew too. It wasn't a question. That moment, two strangers acknowledging an injustice together, was the beginning of an alliance neither of us would be able to name for weeks. I started supporting Sarah indirectly, paying a lawyer named Matthew to reopen the case at the precinct through back channels. Matthew was young, fresh out of law school, and took the case with the enthusiasm of someone who still believes the justice system works. But Richard had tentacles. In less than a week, Matthew was intimidated right outside his office by two men who didn't even have to say a word. They just parked next to his car, stared him down, and drove off. Matthew came to me shaking. He said he needed time to rethink his strategy. I didn't show anger. I never did. But my jaw was clenched tight for 2 straight days. By the third week, Richard escalated things. He found out through his informant at City Hall, a city councilman named Davis, who owed him some old favors, that someone was funding Sarah's legal counsel. And Richard, with his twisted and bruised ego, quickly connected the dots. The reclusive millionaire who had bought silence and a simple life was interfering with his business. So Richard used an angle I hadn't anticipated. He went to the bank that financed my logistics company and, through a contact named Robert and Councilman Davis, planted an anonymous tip about tax fraud. An investigation was launched automatically, a bureaucratic, cold, and devastating process. I woke up one morning to find my corporate accounts frozen as a preventive measure. My employees, dozens of families depended on that cash flow. I had personal savings, but using personal funds to cover business operations was exactly the kind of move that could be flagged as a financial irregularity. It was a perfectly designed trap. For 3 days, I barely slept. I ate very little. I sat at my computer rereading documents with bloodshot eyes, my cup of coffee going cold right next to me. It was the first time in years I felt the ground crumble beneath my feet, realizing no amount of money could easily fix what was standing in my way. Sarah found out from her co-workers that there was an investigation into the man who was helping her. She came to see me. She told me she would drop the lawsuit so I wouldn't have to suffer the consequences. I looked at her with my usual stoic expression and told her in exactly 3 words that it wasn't about her. But it was about her, and we both knew it. In the 4th week, a crack appeared on Richard's side. Amanda, an administrative clerk who managed Richard's properties, had personally witnessed the day he ordered the dogs to be released. She had kept quiet, out of fear, burdened by financial debt to her boss and not knowing who to turn to. But Amanda had a daughter who attended Sarah's school, and when she saw the pregnant teacher still showing up to class under so much pressure, her belly growing, the heavy toll visible in her eyes, something shifted inside Amanda. She reached out to Emily, a local social worker who was connected to Matthew, the lawyer. Emily relayed the information to Matthew, who, despite his fear, hadn't completely given up, just stepped back to strategize. With Amanda's testimony, he realized they had a real shot. But before any formal move could be made, Richard caught wind of it. Not through sophisticated espionage, but because Councilman Davis had overheard hallway gossip at City Hall that one of Richard's clerks was talking to a social worker. Richard confronted Amanda, not with physical violence, but with something far more cruel. He threatened to terminate her employment contract and make sure she never found another job in the entire county. For Amanda, a single mother, that meant absolute ruin. She backed down. The testimony was pulled. Matthew called me, his voice totally defeated, telling me we had lost our witness. I stood by my apartment window for a long time that night. The city lights below blinked with indifference. And for the first time in weeks, I thought about giving up, not on Sarah, but on doing things by the book. Because I had tried to do things the right way, through the proper channels, and Richard had blocked every door with the precision of someone who designed the maze. It was Sarah who pulled me out of that dark place. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, having gotten my address from Emily, clutching a folder of documents under her arm. Inside the folder were copies of municipal notices from the past 3 years, records of archived complaints, and a pattern of zoning violations that Sarah had noticed over the months. Because she was the kind of person who observed, compared, and hoarded information like someone gathering evidence. She wasn't just the victim in this story. She was the sharpest witness we had. She told me she had seen the property deeds that afternoon scattered across the warehouse floor, and snapped pictures with her phone while waiting for me to scare the dogs away, figuring she might need them someday. She spread the photos across my table. I looked at her for a long second, then down at the pictures. It was the missing piece. I called Matthew that very night. He picked up on the third ring, his tone still heavy with despair. When I explained what Sarah had brought me, there was dead silence on the line. Then, a deep sigh. He told me this changed everything. Armed with the photos and the paper trails Sarah had documented, Matthew reopened the case, not through direct criminal charges this time, but as a municipal zoning and administrative fraud lawsuit, an arena where Richard didn't have the same shields. His bank guy Robert had no jurisdiction there. Councilman Davis couldn't block it. The filing was sent to the state administrative board with the help of Diane, a state prosecutor Matthew knew from law school, who had been waiting years for a case with enough solid documentation to withstand political pressure. Diane was a different breed. She was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, and eyes that could pierce right through any bluff. When we had our first meeting in her office, Matthew, Sarah, and me, Diane flipped through the documents in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Then she closed the folder, took off her glasses, and looked straight at Sarah, asking if she knew things would get worse before they got better. Sarah nodded. She didn't say a word, just nodded. Diane put her glasses back on and said it was time to get to work. Once officially notified, Richard tried one last desperate move. He sent a third-party attorney to Sarah's school with a substantial financial settlement in exchange for destroying the evidence. A messenger in a suit waited in the lobby while Sarah opened the envelope in the teacher's lounge. Inside was a check large enough to change any public school teacher's life forever, along with a short, typed letter filled with cold legal jargon that essentially boiled down to a simple demand: disappear. Sarah read the proposal, folded the paper in half, and handed it back with a single handwritten line, stating that you cannot buy someone who has already lost their fear. The messenger left speechless. That night, Sarah called me for the first time. Not to ask for help or to thank me, but just to warn me she thought he was going to try something worse now. She was right. 2 days later, Sarah was walking home from school when she noticed a car parked at the corner of her street. It wasn't the kind of car you usually saw in that neighborhood. Tinted windows, engine idling. She slowed her pace, gripped her backpack straps tighter, and hurried through her front gate, her heart pounding in her chest. The car didn't move. It sat there for over an hour before slowly driving away. The next day, the same car was back, same corner, same silent waiting. Sarah didn't tell me right away. She told Emily, who told Matthew, who called me in a panic. When I heard the news, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pure, unadulterated rage. Not the performative kind where you slam your fist on a desk and yell, but the cold, calculated anger of a man deciding to take action. I called an old contact, Steve, a retired cop who now ran a private security firm. I asked him to run discreet patrols around Sarah's block. Steve didn't ask questions. He just said he was on it. On the third day, the car didn't show up, but the tension lingered. Sarah started having trouble sleeping. She would wake up in the middle of the night with sweaty palms and a racing heart, terrified for the baby she was carrying and everything that could go wrong. She never talked about it, but I could see it. I saw it in the way she held her teacup with both hands when we met at Matthew's office. I saw it in the lingering silence before she answered any question. I saw it in how she constantly glanced out the window, always checking if someone was watching from the outside. I recognized that look. It was the same look I had in the mirrors of the mansion I grew up in, back when I was a kid, and my father would come home late, smelling of expensive cigars and dirty decisions. The look of someone who knows danger is out there, but doesn't know when it will knock on the door. And it was exactly at that moment, when Sarah was at her most vulnerable, when I was fully committed, and when Matthew was finally hopeful, that Richard made his ultimate play. Amanda, the clerk who had backed out, resurfaced, not out of sudden bravery, but because her daughter had written a school essay about people she admired, and she wrote about Sarah, the teacher who never gives up, the teacher who fights even while pregnant, the teacher who proves that doing the right thing is worth it. Amanda read that essay at a parent-teacher conference, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, and broke down in tears. She cried because she realized her own fear was teaching her daughter that bending the knee was the only option in life, and she absolutely refused to let that happen. The very next morning, Amanda walked into Matthew's office. No warning, no appointment. She sat down and declared she was going to testify, and this time, no matter what happened, she wasn't backing down. Amanda's deposition was recorded in a small room at the courthouse, with only Diane, Matthew, and a court stenographer present. Amanda spoke non-stop for 40 minutes. She detailed how Richard had purchased the dogs from an illegal breeding ring just 3 days before the incident, how he had personally driven to the abandoned lot and unleashed the animals half an hour before Sarah's usual route took her past the warehouse, how he sat in his truck, watching from a distance, just waiting. When Amanda finished, her hands were trembling. Diane turned off the recorder, leaned across the table, and simply said, "Thank you." Matthew called me the second he stepped out of the courthouse. His voice sounded different, rock solid. He told me we finally had enough to nail him, but Richard wasn't the kind of man to just sit around, and wait for justice to catch up with him. He always struck first. 2 days after Amanda's testimony, I got a call from Arthur at 6 in the morning. He never called that early. My stomach tied in knots as I answered. Arthur told me we had a massive problem, that the city had suspended the company's operating license without any prior warning or formal notice, just a hard lock on our operations. I got out of bed and walked over to the window, the city still cloaked in darkness. I asked him when it happened, and he said the system updated after hours last night. It had to be Councilman Davis. Richard had cashed in his last desperate chip. If my logistics company shut down, dozens of families would lose their paychecks, contracts would be breached, and suppliers wouldn't get paid. The entire framework would collapse in a matter of days. I threw on the first clothes I could find and drove straight to City Hall. I got there before 7, while the building was still locked. I leaned against my car, watching the municipal workers arrive one by one, their faces wearing the exhaustion of years of early mornings. As soon as the security guard unlocked the doors, I walked in with the first wave of employees and headed straight for the licensing department. The clerk, a woman in her 40s with short hair and a badge that read Allison, greeted me with a look that told me she already knew why I was there. She told me I needed an appointment without even making eye contact. I told her I couldn't wait and that my business had been shut down without cause. Allison typed something into her computer, taking her time, then looked at the screen with an unreadable expression. She said the system showed an anonymous tip reporting structural violations at my commercial property, and the suspension was standard protocol until a full inspection could be completed. I asked her who filed the complaint, and this time she looked right at me. Her eyes said it all. She knew it was a setup, but her hands were tied. I walked out of City Hall, hands shoved deep in my pockets. My jaw clenched so hard it ached. I called Matthew, who picked up immediately. I told him Richard had struck again by freezing my business license. Matthew went quiet for 3 seconds, then said Richard was trying to bankrupt me before the trial could move forward, hoping to force me to back off. I told him I wasn't backing down. He said he knew that, but Richard knew it too, which was exactly why he would keep turning the screws. I hung up and stood in the City Hall parking lot for a long time. The morning sun was starting to heat up the asphalt, and people were rushing by, minding their own business. It was just another ordinary day in a Midwestern town where injustices happened quietly and life just went on. But not for me. Not anymore. I drove to Sarah's house that afternoon. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up and rang the doorbell. She opened the door, looking surprised, one hand resting on her heavily pregnant belly. She asked if something had happened. I told her yes, but that wasn't why I was there. She invited me in. Her house was modest, clean, and neatly organized. There were books stacked on a makeshift shelf made of bricks and wooden planks, graded notebooks spread across the dining table, and an old ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. I sat on the couch while Sarah took the chair across from me, watching me with that same sharp, observant gaze. I told her I came to ask her one question. Why hadn't she given up? Sarah tilted her head, thinking for a moment, then said that if she gave up, she would be teaching her unborn son that fear is more powerful than doing the right thing, and she refused to let him grow up in a world where that was the truth. Her words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Sitting there on that worn-out couch, looking at this pregnant woman who had more courage in her little finger than I had in my entire body, I finally realized something. I wasn't helping Sarah out of a sense of inherited guilt. I wasn't doing it out of moral obligation. I was helping her because, for the first time in years, I had met someone who genuinely made me want to be a better man. I told her thank you. Sarah frowned, asking what for. I said for reminding me that some things in this world can still be fixed. She gave me a small, genuine smile. I left her house with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt when I arrived. I immediately called Diane. She answered in a hushed tone, whispering that she was in the middle of a hearing. I told her it was urgent and we needed to talk today. She sighed and told me to be at her office at 6. I was there on the dot. Diane walked in 10 minutes later, clutching a folder, looking like someone who had spent the entire day battling powerful people. I told her Richard was accelerating his timeline, shutting down my business and squeezing everyone around us because he knew Amanda's testimony was rock solid and he wanted to break us before the case went to court. Diane opened her folder, pulled out a document, and slid it across her desk. She told me she knew, which was why she had accelerated things on her end too. The administrative board had officially accepted the lawsuit, and the preliminary hearing was set for next week. I stared at the stamped official document. I asked her if we really only had 1 week. She confirmed it, adding that Richard would be served the next morning, and once he got the notice, he would realize his window to manipulate the situation had completely closed. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't relief. It was just the stark realization that the scales were finally starting to tip in our favor. But Richard still had one final, desperate card to play. The next morning, Sarah didn't show up for work. Her colleagues called her house, but no one answered. They tried her cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail. Worried, one of the teachers drove over to Sarah's place. The front door was locked, the windows were shut tight, and there was absolutely no sign of movement. Matthew called me, his voice trembling with panic, to tell me Sarah was gone. My stomach completely dropped. I asked him what he meant by gone, and he said nobody knew where she was. And the last time anyone had seen her was the night before. I hung up and immediately dialed Steve. He picked up on the first ring. I told him I needed him to track someone down right now. Steve activated 3 of his best contacts, in under an hour, all former cops who knew how to work fast and stay entirely off the radar. They canvassed Sarah's neighborhood, interviewed the neighbors, and checked every local emergency room. Nothing. She had vanished into thin air. I called Matthew and told him we had to involve the police. He said he had all protocol and treating it as a standard missing persons case only after 48 hours had passed. I yelled into the phone, furious, reminding him she was 8 months pregnant. He said he knew, but their hands were tied by red tape. I slammed the phone down and stood in the middle of my living room trying to piece it all together. It had to be Richard. But what exactly had he done, and where was Sarah? Amanda was the one who provided the breakthrough. She called Matthew 2 hours later, her voice shaking, to report she had seen Richard's truck leaving town the night before, heading out toward the rural county limits. Matthew relayed the tip to me immediately. I asked if Steve knew that area, and before he could answer, I was already dialing Steve's number. Steve knew the rural outskirts like the back of his hand. He knew every dirt road, every abandoned farm, and every forgotten barn in that part of the county. Half an hour later, I was riding shotgun in his SUV, bouncing over pothole-riddled dirt roads as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. Steve kept his eyes locked on the road, explaining that if Richard had taken her somewhere isolated, it would be to one of the undeveloped properties he owned out there. He mentioned 3 parcels of land registered under Richard's name in that sector, and we were going to check them one by one. The first property was a dead end, just overgrown weeds and a half-finished foundation abandoned years ago. The second lot showed fresh tire tracks in the dirt, but there were no vehicles and no signs of life. The third property sat at the very end of a dead-end road, surrounded by massive soybean fields that stretched out as far as the eye could see. Tucked away in the back, partially obscured by a dense line of trees, was a weathered wooden barn. Richard's truck was parked right out front. Steve killed the engine about 200 yards away and pulled a pair of binoculars from under his seat. He watched the barn for a solid minute before confirming there was someone inside, noting movement near one of the side windows. My heart hammered against my ribs. I asked if it was Sarah. He said he couldn't see clearly, but someone was definitely in there. Steve pulled out his phone, saying he needed to call the local sheriff's department because if we went in without a warrant, any evidence we found could be thrown out of court. I asked him what would happen if we didn't have time to wait, my voice coming out much harsher than I intended. Steve looked at me, slowly put his phone away, and said then we were going in. We slipped out of the SUV in complete silence and approached the property from the side, using the tree line for cover. The sun was nearly gone, casting long orange shadows across the field. As we crept closer to the barn, I could hear voices echoing from inside. One was Richard's, loud and erratic. The other was weak and muffled, but it was unmistakably Sarah's. Steve motioned for me to stay put while he ghosted up to the side window, took a quick peek, and glided back. He whispered that she was in there, tied to a chair, and Richard was pacing back and forth, ranting and looking completely unhinged. I asked if she was okay, and he said he wasn't sure, but she was conscious. I took a deep breath and asked what the play was. Steve thought for a split second, then laid out the plan. He would go to the front doors and draw Richard's attention, and as soon as Richard moved toward the front, I would slip through the side window, grab Sarah, and get her out of there. I asked what we would do if he had a gun. Steve confidently replied that he didn't, noting he had seen Richard's hands and they were totally empty. There was no time to second-guess the strategy, so I just nodded. Steve circled around to the front of the barn while I crouched beneath the side window, my heart pounding so violently I was sure Richard could hear it. Then Steve hammered on the heavy front doors, 3 sharp, booming knocks. He yelled for Richard to open up, identifying himself as law enforcement. The barn went dead silent, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps. Richard yanked the door open and started shouting about private property and trespassing. While Richard was busy arguing with Steve at the entrance, I carefully unlatched the side window, slid it open as quietly as possible, and climbed inside. Sarah was sitting on a wooden chair in the middle of the dusty floor, clutching her stomach with both hands. When she saw me, her eyes went wide with shock. I pressed a finger to my lips, signaling her to stay absolutely quiet, and rushed over to her. I helped her to her feet. She was shaking uncontrollably, but managed to stand. I whispered, asking if she was all right, and she nodded, though her exhausted, terrified eyes told a different story. I guided her toward the window, helping her climb out into the cool evening air. We moved away from the barn together through the tall grass, while Steve continued to keep Richard occupied at the front. By the time we reached the SUV, Steve was already jogging up right behind us. We piled in, Steve cranked the engine, and we tore out of there, throwing gravel in our wake. Richard didn't even realize what had happened until we were already speeding down the main road. I drove Sarah straight to the emergency room, where the doctors immediately took her in. She was severely dehydrated and suffering from emotional shock. But the baby's heartbeat was strong and steady. They put her on an IV drip and admitted her overnight for observation. While she rested in the hospital bed, Steve and I headed straight to the police station. This time, we didn't have to deal with local corruption. We were met by Captain Miller, a newly transferred precinct commander who listened to everything we had to say with sharp intensity. When we finished, she stood up and calmly stated she was issuing an arrest warrant immediately. Richard was dragged out of his house in handcuffs in the early hours of the morning. He fought the cops, screaming that it was a witch hunt, claiming he was just having a conversation with Sarah and that she had gone to the barn willingly. But Sarah's sworn statement, backed by the documented history of threats and Amanda's devastating testimony, sealed his fate entirely. The administrative board hearing went forward 3 days later. Richard wasn't there. He was sitting in a jail cell. His high-priced defense attorney tried to file for an extension, but Diane aggressively blocked the motion. The tribunal reviewed the mountain of evidence and ruled against him. Richard was hit with catastrophic administrative fines that completely bankrupted his real estate portfolio, and his massive commercial development project was permanently cancelled. Over the next few months, Richard lost all his municipal contracts. His political allies abandoned him, and he was stripped of the informal power he had wielded from the shadows for decades. He ended up a broken, bitter shadow of his former self, wandering the very same abandoned industrial district where he had tried to destroy the life of a pregnant woman. Sarah gave birth 2 weeks after the trial concluded. It was a perfectly healthy baby girl with big, curious eyes, exactly like her mother's. She texted me a picture while I was sitting in my office. I stared at the photo of Sarah holding her newborn daughter, flashing a tired but genuinely whole smile, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Real, profound hope. I made sure I was there the day Sarah returned to work at the middle school after her maternity leave, carrying her infant daughter in a chest carrier. I didn't go inside the building. I stayed parked out front in the same car I always drove, but I stayed for much less time than I had on that